In 1778, a small drapery shop opened on Wigmore Street in London. It survived the French Revolution. It survived two world wars. It survived the Great Depression, the Blitz, the collapse of the British Empire, and the rise of the supermarket. It survived everything. Then, in the spring of 2021, after 243 years, it was gone. At its peak, Debenhams was the heartbeat of the British High Street, 240 stores across the United Kingdom and Ireland, 5 floors of everything a family could need, perfume counters on the ground floor where the air smelled of Chanel number 5 before you even reached the door, bridal departments where mothers cried, toy sections where children pressed their noses to the glass, and upstairs, always upstairs, a restaurant where a pot of tea and a slice of Victoria sponge meant that Saturday had officially begun. 12,000 people went to work there every morning. Then one December, during a pandemic nobody had planned for, the doors closed. The tills went silent. The lights went out, and Debenhams, 2.5 centuries of British retail, was sold for the price of a name. How does a store that survived the Blitz fail to survive a website? That question has an answer, and it is more deliberate and more devastating than most people know. The story begins not with a boardroom, not with a business plan, but with a bolt of cloth. In 1778, a man named William Clark opened a small drapery shop at 44 Wigmore Street in the Marylebone district of London. The street was quiet then, a neighborhood of tradespeople, modest townhouses, and women who sewed their own curtains and dressed their own children. Clark's shop was unremarkable from the outside. A narrow frontage, a wooden sign, bolts of fabric stacked in the window. But inside, something was different. Clark understood something that most merchants of his era did not. Women who did most of the household buying were rarely treated as serious customers. They were expected to take what was offered, pay what was asked, and leave without complaint. Clark ran his shop differently. Fabric was displayed so it could be touched. Prices were marked clearly. No haggling, no guesswork. If a customer wanted to stand at the counter for 20 minutes comparing 2 shades of wool, she was welcome to do so. It was a small act of respect, but in 1778, it was almost revolutionary. The shop grew steadily through the end of the 18th century, surviving the economic disruptions that followed the American Revolution and the long drain of the Napoleonic Wars. By the early 1800s, the business had expanded its stock: linens, silks, haberdashery, household fabrics, and had built a small but loyal clientele among the middle-class women of central London. Then, in 1813, a man named William Debenham entered the picture. Debenham was a Suffolk-born merchant with capital to invest and ambitions that extended well beyond Wigmore Street. He bought into the business as a partner, and the shop was renamed Clark and Debenham. It was a practical arrangement at first. Debenham's money, Clark's established reputation. But Debenham brought something else with him, a conviction that a drapery shop could become something far larger than a drapery shop. He believed that shopping, real shopping, unhurried and pleasurable, could become a destination in its own right. Over the following decades, the business changed hands and names several times as partners came and went, and the Victorian era reshaped London around it. By the 1850s, the firm had moved to larger premises on Wigmore Street and had expanded its range well beyond fabric. Ready-to-wear clothing was beginning to emerge as a category. The middle class was growing. Department stores, the grand multi-floor emporia that would define Victorian retail, were starting to appear in Paris and New York, and London was watching closely. The Debenham family, now firmly in control of the business, saw what was coming. Rather than resist the new format, they moved toward it. The Wigmore Street premises were expanded, new departments were added, and in 1905 the company opened a flagship store on Welbeck Street that announced in no uncertain terms that this was no longer a draper's shop. It was a destination. What made Debenhams different from its competitors in those early years was not size. Marshall and Snellgrove had more square footage. Harrods had more prestige. What Debenhams had was a particular understanding of its customer. Its customer was not the aristocracy. She was not browsing for sport. She was a woman with a household to run, a budget to manage, and a limited number of hours in which to spend it. She wanted quality she could trust, at prices she could justify, in a shop where nobody made her feel inadequate for asking the price. That instinct, practical, respectful, accessible without being cheap, would define Debenhams for most of the 20th century. It was the foundation on which everything else was built, and for a very long time, it was enough. By the time the First World War ended, Debenhams had already begun acquiring other department stores across the country, absorbing local names, local loyalties, local histories into a growing national network. The strategy was deliberate. Rather than building new stores in unfamiliar towns, Debenhams bought stores that communities already trusted. It inherited their customers, their staff, their goodwill. It was an approach that would carry the company through the middle of the 20th century and make it eventually the largest department store group in Britain. But it also planted the first seed of a problem that would take decades to fully grow. When you are built from other people's identities, the question of your own is never entirely settled. Ask anyone in Britain who grew up in the 1960s or 1970s what Saturday meant, and the answer comes back in layers. It meant the smell of floor polish and perfume the moment the doors open. It meant the particular weight of a wire shopping basket on the arm. It meant escalators, real wooden-edged escalators that groaned slightly under your feet, carrying families from floor to floor through a building that felt, to a child, approximately the size of a small country. For millions of British families across those 2 decades, Saturday meant Debenhams. By the early 1960s, Debenhams operated more than 60 stores across England, Scotland, and Wales. Not all of them carried the Debenhams name. Many still traded under the local names the company had acquired over the previous 40 years. Bobby's in Bournemouth, Brown's of Chester, Marshall and Snellgrove on Oxford Street. But they shared a common character. Each one anchored its high street the way a church anchors a village square. Not because people needed it every day, but because it was always there, always open, and always the place you went when something mattered. A new school uniform, a winter coat, a wedding present chosen carefully from the home department on the 3rd floor. These were not casual purchases, they were occasions. And Debenhams understood how to make occasions feel like occasions. The ground floor was always perfume and cosmetics. This was not accidental, it was theater. The moment a customer stepped through the door, she was met with glass counters lit from below, rows of lipstick in colors that had names like Venetian Rose and Autumn Smoke, and sales assistants in black uniforms who knew the difference between a day fragrance and an evening fragrance, and were happy to explain it at length. For women who spent most of their week managing households on tight budgets, the Debenhams beauty counter was something close to a luxury. Not because the prices were extravagant, they were not, but because standing there being attended to, being offered a spritz of something French on the inside of your wrist, felt like being taken seriously. It cost nothing to walk in. It cost nothing to browse. And that openness, the absence of obligation, the sense that the store belonged to anyone who entered it, was one of the things customers would remember long after the specific purchases had been forgotten. But if the ground floor was theater, the restaurant was ceremony. Every Debenhams of any size had one, usually on the 3rd or 4th floor. Sometimes a cafeteria-style arrangement with trays and a hot counter, sometimes something slightly more formal with tablecloths and a printed menu. The food was resolutely, unapologetically British. Chicken pie with a short pastry lid, poached salmon with boiled potatoes, trifle in individual glass dishes with a precise layer of cream on top, a pot of tea that arrived with a small metal jug of milk, and 2 shortbread biscuits wrapped in paper. None of it was remarkable food. That was almost the point. It tasted exactly as expected every time, in every store, in every city. A woman from Leeds eating lunch in the Debenhams restaurant in Southampton knew precisely what she was going to get. That consistency, that absolute unshowy reliability, was itself a form of comfort. Families built their Saturdays around it. The shopping would be done first, bags collected from various departments, then the reward. A table by the window, the sound of cutlery on china. Children allowed a glass of lemonade if they had behaved. A moment of rest in the middle of the week's one day of relative leisure. For a generation of British women who rarely ate out anywhere else, the Debenhams restaurant was, without exaggeration, a treat. What was it about a department store restaurant that no other kind of eating out could replicate? It was the complete absence of any social pressure, no wine list, no dress code, no sense that the establishment was doing you a favor by seating you. Just food served calmly at a table you had earned by the simple act of arriving. Away from the restaurant and the beauty counters, Debenhams in the 1960s and 1970s was a store built for the rhythms of ordinary British life. The linen department smelled of sizing and new cotton. The menswear floor carried suits for weddings and funerals with equal readiness. The toy department, always the toy department, was where children were permitted to slow down, to touch things, to want things with a specificity that parents filed away for Christmas. And Christmas was its own chapter entirely. From late October onwards, the Debenhams Christmas shop transformed one floor, sometimes two, into something that resembled a controlled, carpeted hallucination of tinsel and goodwill. Artificial trees in four sizes, advent calendars, decorations in coordinated color schemes that changed each year, cards in boxes of 25, wrapping paper that cost a little more than the supermarkets but came in rolls wide enough to actually wrap something properly. It was not the Harrods Christmas grotto. It was not meant to be. It was Christmas for people who had a list and a budget and needed to get through it sensibly in a building warm enough that the children stopped complaining for an hour. That too was a form of magic. The employees who worked in Debenhams during these decades remember the culture with a consistency that is striking, given how many different stores were involved and how many different towns they served. There was a formality to the floor. Supervisors wore different uniforms from junior staff. Customers were addressed as madam or sir without irony. Complaints were handled by a dedicated customer service desk on the ground floor, staffed by women who had, by all accounts, the patience of minor saints. A sales assistant named Margaret, who joined the Debenhams in Birmingham in 1967 at the age of 17 and stayed for over 2 decades, described her early years on the floor this way. The training lasted 3 weeks, covering everything from how to wrap a purchase correctly to how to approach a customer who appeared to be looking without intending to buy. The emphasis throughout, she recalled, was on making the customer feel that she had come to the right place, that whatever she needed, Debenhams had it, and that she would not be made to feel foolish for asking. That was the standard. And for most of that era, it was met. There is a reason that people who shopped at Debenhams in the 1960s and 1970s do not simply say they remember the store. They say they remember how it felt. The warmth of the building on a cold November morning, the particular acoustic of a shop floor, the muffled sounds, the sense of being inside something solid and permanent, the weight of a bag from the home department in each hand on the walk back to the car park. These are the memories that do not fade because they are not really memories of shopping. They are memories of a particular kind of Saturday, of a country that felt, in those years, like it was being looked after, of a store that asked nothing of you except that you come in. Debenhams at its height was not Britain's most glamorous retailer. It was something more useful than glamorous. It was dependable. And for 2 decades, dependable was exactly what Britain needed. In the years after the Second World War, Britain rebuilt itself with a particular kind of optimism. Bombed city centers were replanned. New housing estates rose on the edges of towns. The National Health Service began. And on high streets across the country, people who had spent 6 years rationing everything from butter to clothing were ready finally to spend. Debenhams was ready to meet them. The company's post-war expansion was not built on ambition alone. It was built on a strategy that was, in its own way, quietly brilliant. Rather than spending capital constructing new stores in unfamiliar markets, Debenhams looked at the map of British retail and saw something useful. Dozens of well-established, well-loved independent department stores, each one anchoring its own town, each one carrying decades of local loyalty, and each one struggling to survive in the new economic landscape. The family-owned department store was a Victorian invention, and by the 1950s, many of them were running on Victorian capital structures. Death duties had weakened the founding families. The cost of modernizing aging buildings was prohibitive. Competition from new formats, supermarkets, chain stores, catalog retailers, was growing. The independent department store, for all its local prestige, was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Debenhams saw the opportunity and moved decisively. Between the late 1940s and the mid-1970s, the company acquired over 60 independent stores across England, Scotland, and Wales. The names were local institutions: Pauldens in Manchester, Plummer Roddis in Hastings, Kennard's in Croydon, Bon Marché in Brixton. Each one had its own history, its own loyal customers, its own staff who had worked there for years. Debenhams, for a time, was careful with what it acquired. Many stores were allowed to keep their original names. Local managers retained day-to-day authority. The Debenhams identity was present but not overwhelming. It was absorption rather than replacement. And in most towns, customers barely noticed the change in ownership because the store they loved continued to feel like theirs. By 1970, Debenhams was the largest department store group in Britain by number of outlets. The footprint stretched from Aberdeen to Plymouth, from Cardiff to Norwich. In dozens of towns across the country, the Debenhams' own store was not merely the largest shop on the high street. It was, for many purposes, the high street itself, the place where the community gathered, spent, and occasionally ran into everyone it knew. The scale was extraordinary, but scale, as Debenhams was beginning to discover, brought its own complications. Running 60-plus stores, acquired from 60-plus different origins, with 60-plus different layouts, staffing cultures, and stock arrangements, was not the same as running a coherent retail business. Each store had its own character. Each one had its own strengths and its own inefficiencies. Centralizing buying, standardizing ranges, and creating a consistent customer experience across a network that had been assembled essentially from other people's businesses. This was a management challenge that would occupy Debenhams for the better part of 3 decades. Some stores thrived under the new ownership. Others coasted. A few began quietly to decline. The next phase of expansion brought a different kind of decision, and a more consequential one. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the shape of British retail began to change. The out-of-town shopping center was arriving. Edge-of-town retail parks were drawing customers away from city centers. And in the 1980s, the enclosed shopping mall, purpose-built, climate-controlled, with car parking and food courts, began to establish itself as the dominant format for British retail. The Arndale Centres, the Mary Hill, Meadow Hall in Sheffield, Metro Centre in Gateshead. These were not just new places to shop. They were new destinations, designed to replace the high street entirely. Debenhams made a decision that seemed logical at the time. It would follow its customers into the malls. New Debenhams stores opened as anchor tenants in shopping centers across the country. The anchor tenant arrangement was, commercially, extremely attractive. The landlord wanted Debenhams more than Debenhams needed any particular mall. A large department store drew foot traffic that benefited every other retailer in the building. This leverage translated into favorable lease terms, prominent positioning, and the kind of long-term rental agreements that gave both parties security. By the mid-1980s, Debenhams was present in virtually every major shopping center in Britain. In 1985, the company was floated on the London Stock Exchange, valued at a figure that reflected its size, its reach, and the confidence of the era. It was by any measure a success story, but the mall strategy carried within it a structural risk that few were prepared to examine clearly. A high street store, however old or tired, occupied a building that the company often owned outright. Its presence on the street was not contingent on the health of the surrounding retail environment. A mall store was different. Its success was inseparable from the success of the mall around it. If the mall declined, if footfall dropped, if smaller tenants left, if the anchor on the other end of the building closed, the Debenhams store suffered regardless of its own management. Debenhams had, in effect, outsourced part of its destiny to the landlords and developers who controlled the spaces it occupied. In the 1980s and early 1990s, this did not appear to matter. The malls were full, the car parks were full. Saturday retail in Britain was booming, and Debenhams, sitting at the center of the boom, appeared invulnerable. There was, however, One more consequence of the expansion years that would prove harder to correct than any lease arrangement. In building a national chain through acquisition, absorbing other stores, other identities, other histories, Debenhams had never quite answered the question that sits at the heart of every retail business. What precisely is this store for? Who precisely is it for? The answer, for most of the post-war decades, had been everyone, every town, every occasion, every budget. It was the store of last resort and first choice simultaneously. The place you went when you needed something and weren't sure where else to go. That answer had served Debenhams well when it was the only option of its kind on the high street. It would serve it considerably less well when the high street stopped being the only place anyone went to shop. But that reckoning was still some years away. For now, the stores were full, the tills were busy, and everything pointed upward. There is a particular kind of institution that exists in every country, one that is not the most expensive, not the most fashionable, not the most talked about, but is in some way that is difficult to articulate precisely, simply there. Woven into the fabric of ordinary life so completely that its presence is taken for granted, the way electricity is taken for granted, or the post. In Britain, from roughly 1975 to roughly 2000, that institution, in retail, was Debenhams. By the late 1970s, the company operated more than 60 stores under the Debenhams name, with further outlets still trading under their original local names. The combined footprint made it the dominant department store group in the country by a considerable margin. There was no town of any size in England, Scotland, or Wales that did not have a Debenhams within reasonable distance. For millions of people, it was simply the store, the default answer to the question of where to go when the purchase mattered. What elevated Debenhams beyond mere size, however, was the role it played at specific moments in British life. The most significant of these was the wedding list. From the 1970s onwards, the Debenhams wedding list registry became, for a broad swathe of Middle Britain, as much a part of getting married as the church booking and the caterer. A couple would visit the store, usually on a weekday afternoon a few months before the wedding, and walk the floors with a clipboard and a sales assistant, selecting the items they wanted: dinner services, glassware, bed linen, kitchen equipment, towels in the color they had chosen for the bathroom they did not yet own. The list was then held at the store. Guests could visit or telephone, purchase a specific item, and have it marked off. On the wedding day itself, or shortly after, the couple collected everything, or had it delivered, in a sequence of large, flat boxes that represented, in the most practical possible terms, the material foundations of a shared life. For a generation of couples who married in the 1970s and 1980s, the Debenhams wedding list was not a retail transaction. It was a rite of passage. The store that held those boxes held, in a very real sense, the beginning of everything that came after. Beyond weddings, Debenhams inserted itself into the calendar of British life with a consistency that only a genuinely national retailer could achieve. Back to school in September meant the uniform department, gray trousers, white shirts, the precise shade of navy blue that the school had specified, purchased with the kind of resigned efficiency that British parents have always brought to the task. The sales assistants knew the local school requirements. The stock was organized accordingly. It was not glamorous. It was not meant to be. It was useful, and it was there. And for parents who needed to outfit 3 children in a fortnight on a limited budget, useful and present were precisely what was required. Christmas meant the decoration department from October onwards, and the toy floor, and the gift sets in the beauty department. Yardley talc and soap in a presentation box, a bottle of Chanel wrapped in tissue in a paper bag with ribbon handles, a set of handkerchiefs that no one under the age of 60 would ever use, but that remained, year after year, the reliable gift for an uncle who was difficult to buy for. And Boxing Day, the 26th of December, meant the sale. The Debenhams Boxing Day sale was, for several decades, a genuine cultural event. Not in the manufactured press release sense of the phrase, but in the straightforward sense that very large numbers of people participated in it, year after year, as a matter of habit and tradition. By the early hours of the 26th, queues had formed outside the larger stores. In the Oxford Street flagship, the queue sometimes stretched to the end of the block before the doors opened at 9. Inside, the first hour was organized chaos. Rails of clothing at half price, homeware reduced by 30 or 40%. The particular noise of several hundred people moving through a space at speed, each one certain that someone else was about to take the thing they had already decided to buy. It was not always a dignified spectacle, but it was unmistakably British. The willingness to stand in the cold for an hour in order to save 12 pounds on a duvet set is not a character flaw so much as a national expression of thrift elevated to sport. Debenhams understood this. The sale was choreographed carefully. The reductions were genuine, not the inflated price then discounted variety that later became standard practice elsewhere. Customers who came on Boxing Day came back the following year because the previous year had been worth it. Trust, built one transaction at a time, over decades. It was also during these peak years that Debenhams made a decision that briefly transformed its reputation in a different direction entirely. In the mid-1990s, the company launched a series of exclusive designer diffusion lines, collections created by named British designers specifically for Debenhams at prices that high street customers could afford. The names were significant: Jasper Conran, John Rocha, Julian MacDonald, Ben DeLisi. These were not obscure figures. They were designers with international reputations, whose work appeared in fashion magazines and on red carpets. The concept was straightforward but genuinely novel for its time. A woman who could not afford a Jasper Conran dress from his mainline collection could buy a Jasper Conran dress from Debenhams for £60. The cut was clean. The fabric was decent. The label inside said what it said. And the experience of owning something with a name attached to it, something that connected the ordinary Saturday shopper to a world she read about but did not normally inhabit, was for many customers quietly thrilling. The designer lines gave Debenhams something it had occasionally lacked, a reason to be chosen rather than simply visited. Not everyone came for Jasper Conran, but enough people did that the collaboration shifted how the store was perceived, from reliable and somewhat staid to reliable and occasionally rather good. What does it mean when a store becomes the place where people begin their lives together, where the wedding list is filed and the first proper dinner service is chosen and the children's first school shoes are bought? It means the store is no longer just a retailer. It is a participant in the things that matter. It is present at the moments people remember. And that presence, accumulated across millions of families over decades, creates something that no balance sheet can adequately capture. It creates loyalty that feels to the people who hold it less like a commercial preference and more like an attachment. Debenhams, at the height of its powers, held that attachment across a significant portion of the British population. What happened next was not inevitable. It was a series of choices, made by specific people, in specific rooms, for specific reasons. And almost every one of them was wrong. In the year 2000, a 26-year-old man named Nick Robertson launched an online fashion retailer from a spare bedroom in West London. The company was called ASOS. Its entire stock in those first months could fit in a transit van. Its annual revenue was essentially zero. That same year, Debenhams reported sales of over £1 billion, operated more than 90 stores across the United Kingdom, and was, by every conventional measure, one of the most successful retailers in the country. Nobody in the Debenhams boardroom lost a moment's sleep over ASOS in the year 2000. That, in retrospect, was the first mistake. The cracks that eventually destroyed Debenhams did not appear suddenly. They formed slowly over the better part of a decade in the way that structural damage forms in an old building. Invisible from the street, detectable only to those who knew where to look, and entirely ignored by everyone whose job it was to look. The fundamental problem was positioning, or rather, the absence of it. Through the 1980s and early 1990s, Debenhams had occupied the middle ground of British retail with confidence, because the middle ground was, broadly speaking, uncontested. Marks & Spencer was its closest competitor in terms of customer profile, but M&S had its own lanes, food, underwear, knitwear, that did not directly overlap with Debenhams's core offer. At the top of the market, John Lewis offered a more premium experience. At the bottom, the new discount chains were growing but had not yet achieved full national scale. Debenhams sat in the center of all this and served everyone adequately. Adequate for a long time was enough. Then within the space of roughly 5 years, the center collapsed. Primark opened its first English store in Derby in 1973, but its serious expansion came in the late 1990s and accelerated sharply through the 2000s. By the middle of that decade, Primark was offering fashion, real fashion, trend-led clothing that moved with the season, at prices that no department store could match. A dress that might cost £45 in Debenhams cost £8 in Primark. The quality was not the same, but for a 19-year-old buying something to wear on a Friday night, quality was not the point. Primark took the bottom of the market and held it with a ferocity that left no room for negotiation. From the other direction, Next had been quietly becoming the most competent mid-market retailer in Britain. Its stores were well-designed and consistently stocked. Its directory catalog, launched in 1988 and developed aggressively through the 1990s, had given it a direct-to-customer channel years before the internet made such things obligatory. Next knew exactly what it was, exactly who it was for, and executed that understanding with a discipline that Debenhams could not match. And then there was the internet. ASOS by 2005 was no longer a curiosity. It was growing at a rate that alarmed serious people. Topshop was expanding. Zara had arrived from Spain with a supply chain fast enough to move from catwalk to shop floor in 2 weeks. H&M was everywhere. The new fashion landscape was being defined by speed, volume, and price, and none of those three things were qualities that a traditional department store, with its long buying cycles and its fixed costs, was naturally equipped to compete on. The response from Debenhams in the early 2000s was not panic. It was something more dangerous than panic. It was complacency dressed as confidence. The stores were still full, at least on weekends. The sales still drew queues. The wedding list business was still solid. The designer collaborations with Jasper Conran and John Rocha were still generating positive press coverage. If you stood inside a busy Debenhams on a Saturday afternoon in 2003 and looked around at the customers, the tills, the shopping bags, it was entirely possible to conclude that nothing was fundamentally wrong. But the numbers, examined more carefully, told a different story. Footfall was beginning to soften. The average transaction value was not growing. Younger customers, the 25 to 35-year-olds who should have been forming the next generation of loyal Debenhams shoppers, were not showing up in the way their parents had. They were going to ASOS, they were going to Zara, they were going to Topshop on Oxford Street and spending 3 hours there with the confidence of people who had found their store. Debenhams was not their store. It was their mother's store. That perception, once established, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. There was a structural problem underneath the competitive one, and it was perhaps more serious. The concession model. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Debenhams had increasingly filled its floor space not with its own branded merchandise, but with concessions. Third-party brands paying rent to operate a counter or a section within the store. The cosmetics halls were the most visible example. Estée Lauder, Clinique, Lancôme, MAC. Each one operating its own branded space, staffed by its own employees, generating its own revenue and returning a percentage to Debenhams. The model made commercial sense in isolation. The concession operators brought their own marketing budgets, their own brand recognition, their own loyal customers. Debenhams received income without the risk of holding stock. On paper, it was an efficient arrangement, but it had a consequence that was harder to see on a spreadsheet. When a customer walked into a Debenhams and spent 45 minutes at the Clinique counter, she was not having a Debenhams experience. She was having a Clinique experience. The store was, for that transaction, essentially invisible. A building that Clinique happened to be operating inside. When she walked out with her bag, her loyalty, if she felt any, was to Clinique, not to Debenhams. Multiply this across dozens of concessions, across hundreds of stores, and you begin to see the problem. Debenhams had outsourced not just its floor space, but its relationship with its own customer. The store was becoming a landlord masquerading as a retailer. How long could a business this size sustain itself on rent and goodwill alone? On the shop floor, in the stores themselves, the changes were being felt before they were being discussed in any boardroom. A floor manager named David, who worked in the Debenhams in Leeds through the early 2000s, described watching the shift with the particular clarity of someone whose job required him to count things. Footfall on weekday afternoons was down. The lunchtime trade, which had once been reliable, was thinning. Customers who came in were increasingly purposeful. They knew what they wanted. They found it, or they didn't, and they left. The browsing culture that had sustained the store for decades, the unhurried Saturday afternoon drift from floor to floor that led to purchases nobody had planned, was diminishing. He raised it with his area manager. The area manager said the figures were in line with targets. David said the figures might be in line with targets, but the store felt different. The area manager said feeling was not a metric. That conversation, or something very like it, was taking place in Debenhams stores across the country in those years. The people closest to the customer could sense the change. The people reading the quarterly reports could not see it yet. And the distance between those two positions, between the felt reality on the floor and the reported reality in the numbers, was the space in which Debenhams lost several years it could not afford to lose. By the time the numbers confirmed what the floor managers already knew, the options had narrowed considerably, and the worst was still to come. In the spring of 2003, Debenhams was taken private. The buyers were three private equity firms: CVC Capital Partners, Texas Pacific Group, and Merrill Lynch Private Equity. The price was approximately $1.7 billion. It was, on the surface, a straightforward transaction. A publicly listed retailer, underperforming against its potential, acquired by investors who believed they could extract more value from it than the market had managed to do. What followed was not a rescue. It was a systematic dismantling of the financial foundations on which the company stood, conducted legally, structured cleverly, and devastating in its long-term consequences. The mechanism was debt. Private equity acquisitions of this type are almost always leveraged, meaning the buyers use borrowed money to fund the purchase, then place that debt onto the balance sheet of the company they have bought. Debenhams, which had entered 2003 as a company with manageable borrowings, emerged from the transaction carrying approximately $1.7 billion in debt. Debt it had not incurred, debt it had not chosen, debt that now had to be serviced, interest paid, covenants maintained, from the operating revenues of a retail business that was already beginning to face competitive pressure from every direction. The annual interest payments on that debt consumed resources that might otherwise have gone into store refurbishment, staff training, technology investment, or the development of an online retail capability. Every pound that left the business to service alone was a pound that did not go into the floor, the fitting rooms, the website, or the customer. The debt was not a side effect of the acquisition. It was the mechanism by which value was extracted from the business and transferred to its new owners. But the debt was only part of the story. Within months of taking Debenhams private, the new owners executed a sale and leaseback of the company's property portfolio. The transaction worked as follows. Debenhams sold the freehold of the buildings it owned, stores it had occupied in some cases for decades, to property investors. It then signed long-term leases to remain in those buildings as a tenant, paying rent at market rates. The immediate effect was a large cash inflow. The properties were sold for considerable sums, and that cash went in the main to the private equity owners and to reduce the acquisition debt. It was, from the buyer's perspective, an elegant piece of financial engineering. They had acquired a retailer and almost immediately recovered a significant portion of their investment by liquidating its real estate. The long-term effect was catastrophic. Debenhams, which had previously owned a substantial property portfolio, an asset base that represented genuine financial stability, was now a tenant in its own stores. The annual rent payments added hundreds of millions of pounds to the company's fixed cost base. These were not costs that could be reduced in a downturn, renegotiated away in a bad quarter, or temporarily suspended during a crisis. They were contractual obligations, extending in many cases for 25 years or more. enforceable regardless of what happened to the retail environment around them. The stores that Debenhams had spent a century accumulating, bought, built, and paid for by the labor and loyalty of generations of staff and customers, were gone. In their place was a lease, a piece of paper that said Debenhams could continue to occupy the building, provided it kept paying for as long as the lease ran. If it stopped paying, it would have to leave. In 2006, 3 years after taking the company private, the private equity consortium floated Debenhams back on the London Stock Exchange. The flotation valued the company at approximately $1.7 billion, roughly what they had paid for it. The headline number suggested the owners had made no profit. The reality was considerably different. Through the debt loading, the property sale, the management fees charged during the private period, and the dividend payments extracted from the business during those 3 years, the private equity firms had recovered multiples of their original equity investment. They had, in the language of the industry, generated a strong return. What they left behind was a publicly listed retailer carrying roughly $1 billion in net debt, stripped of its property assets, locked into long-term leases on stores it no longer owned, and facing a retail landscape that was changing faster than at any point in the previous century. The institutional investors who bought shares in the 2006 flotation were not ignorant of the debt. It was disclosed. What they could not have fully anticipated was how little room for maneuver that debt would leave when the world changed. And the world was about to change. The financial crisis of 2008 did not destroy Debenhams, but it tightened the vice considerably. Consumer spending contracted sharply. Footfall in town centers and shopping centers fell. The middle market, always Debenhams territory, was squeezed from both ends as shoppers either traded down to Primark or stayed home entirely. The company's revenues came under pressure at precisely the moment when its debt obligations left it least able to respond. Between 2008 and 2014, Debenhams went through a succession of management teams, each one inheriting the same fundamental problem and attempting to address it with the resources available, which were, given the interest payments and the rent, never enough. Store refurbishment programs were announced and then scaled back. Technology investment was perpetually deferred. The online operation, which should have been a strategic priority from the mid-2000s onwards, remained underfunded and underbuilt well into the 2010s. A customer visiting the Debenhams website in 2012 was not encountering a serious retail proposition. She was encountering a digital afterthought. Meanwhile, ASOS was processing millions of orders a week. In 2016, the company appointed a new chief executive. Sergio Bucher was a former Amazon executive, a fact that should in itself have conveyed something about what the board believed the problem to be. Bucher arrived with a clear diagnosis and a plan he called Debenhams Redesigned. The strategy involved reducing the store estate, investing heavily in the remaining locations, rebuilding the online operation, and clarifying what Debenhams actually stood for in a market that had fragmented beyond recognition. It was, by most assessments, the correct plan. It identified the real problems. It proposed credible solutions. It was supported by enough internal evidence to be taken seriously. It was not given the resources to succeed. The debt that the private equity firms had loaded onto the business in 2003 was still there, in various refinanced and restructured forms. The rent obligations were still there. The fixed costs were still there. Every pound that Bucher's team needed to invest in transforming the business was a pound that was already committed elsewhere. The plan required capital. The business had almost none to spare. And who exactly was supposed to have protected this company from the consequences of decisions made in a boardroom 13 years earlier? The answer, when it came, was nobody. There was no mechanism for accountability. The private equity firms had taken their returns and moved on. The institutional investors who had bought shares in 2006 had largely sold. The people left holding the consequences were the staff on the shop floor, the suppliers waiting to be paid, and the pension fund members who had spent decades assuming their retirement savings were secure. There was one further chapter in the corporate drama before the end, and it requires a name: Mike Ashley. Ashley was the founder of Sports Direct, a man whose approach to retail was characterized by those who worked with him and those who competed against him as relentlessly aggressive. Beginning in 2018, Ashley began accumulating Debenhams shares through Sports Direct, eventually building a stake of approximately 30%, large enough to make him the single biggest shareholder, but not large enough to control the company outright. What followed was a protracted and frequently ugly confrontation between Ashley and the Debenhams board. Ashley wanted a seat on the board, which the board refused. He wanted his Sports Direct stores installed as concessions within Debenhams locations. He made a series of proposals that were rejected. He threatened legal action. He lobbied shareholders. He gave interviews in which he characterized the board as incompetent and himself as the only person willing to save the business. The board, for its part, regarded Ashley's interest as opportunistic rather than constructive, and his proposals as serving Sports Direct's interests rather than Debenhams. Whether either party was right is, at this point, largely academic. What the Ashley episode consumed, for the better part of 18 months, was attention, energy, and time. The management of a business in genuine distress was diverted into defending against a shareholder war at precisely the moment when every available hour should have been spent on the customers, the stores, and the survival plan. The stores, during all of this, continued to age. The carpets in the fitting rooms were the same carpets that had been there for a decade. The lighting in the menswear departments had not been updated. The signage was faded. The customer experience was declining in the slow, demoralizing way that underfunded things decline. Not catastrophically, but steadily, in ways that customers registered without necessarily articulating. They just stopped coming as often. Then they stopped coming at all. By the end of 2018, Debenhams was negotiating with its lenders to restructure its debt for what felt like the 100th time. The company that William Clark had founded in 1778, that William Debenham had built into a national institution, that had clothed and fed and furnished the lives of millions of British families for over 2 centuries, was running out of road. What remained was the collapse itself. And when it came in 2 acts. On the 9th of April 2019, Debenhams filed for administration. The announcement came early in the morning, before the stores opened. Employees arriving for their shifts found out the way most people find out bad news in the modern era. On their phones, reading a news alert, standing in a car park or on a bus or at a kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside them. Some had known something was coming. Most had hoped it would not. The first administration was technically a managed process. The company was placed into pre-pack administration, a legal mechanism designed to allow a business to shed its most burdensome obligations while continuing to trade. 50 stores were identified for closure. Approximately 4,000 jobs were lost. The lenders took control of the business from the shareholders, wiping out the equity, including Mike Ashley's 30% stake, which became worthless overnight. Ashley, who had been attempting to mount a last-minute rescue, described the outcome as a stitch-up. The lenders said it was the only viable path. The 4,000 people who lost their jobs said nothing that was recorded. For customers, the first administration was disorienting rather than definitive. The stores that remained open continued to trade. The sale rails were restocked. The beauty counters kept their lights on. If you walked into a Debenhams in the summer of 2010 and did not follow retail news closely, nothing looked catastrophically wrong. There were fewer stores than before. The ranges were slightly thinner, but the doors were open and the tills were working, and it was possible, if you wanted to believe it, to conclude that the worst had passed. It had not passed, it had barely begun. The restructured Debenhams that emerged from the first administration was lighter in debt, but not free of it. The rent obligations remained, the fixed costs remained, the fundamental question of what the store was for and who it was for remained entirely unanswered. The administration process had addressed the symptoms without touching the disease. Through the second half of 2019 and into 2020, the company traded under a kind of suspended animation, continuing to function, continuing to employ people, continuing to occupy its stores, while the underlying numbers moved in only one direction. New management was appointed. Cost reductions were implemented. Negotiations with landlords over rent levels were conducted with varying degrees of success. A renewed focus on the online operation was announced. There were press releases and strategy updates, and the language of cautious optimism that businesses in difficulty deploy when they are not yet ready to admit how serious the difficulty has become. The customers, meanwhile, were making their own decisions. Footfall continued to fall. The Christmas trading period of 2019, always the most critical weeks in the retail calendar, the weeks on which Debenhams had built its reputation over generations, was deeply disappointing. The Boxing Day queues that had once stretched around the block were gone. In their place, a modest crowd of bargain hunters moving through stores that felt, to anyone who remembered what they had once been, half empty in a way that had nothing to do with the stock on the shelves. Then, in March 2020, a pandemic arrived. The timing was, for Debenhams, simply annihilating. On the 23rd of March, the British government announced a national lockdown. All non-essential retail was ordered to close. Debenhams shut every store in the country overnight. The tills went dark. The fitting rooms were locked. The mannequins stood in empty windows on empty high streets across the United Kingdom. In normal circumstances, a temporary closure of this kind would be survivable for a business with adequate reserves, manageable debt, and flexible cost structures. Debenhams had none of these things. The rent obligations continued to accrue on stores that were generating zero revenue. The fixed costs continued. The debt continued. Every week of closure was a week of hemorrhage with no corresponding income. The company applied for government support under the schemes made available during the lockdown period. It negotiated with its lenders. It negotiated with its landlords. It explored options for a sale of the business, approaching potential buyers who might be willing to acquire all or part of the operation as a going concern. One by one, the options closed. JD Sports Fashion entered negotiations to acquire Debenhams in the autumn of 2020. The talks proceeded far enough to generate genuine hope among the people watching from inside the business. The store managers, the department heads, the buyers, the warehouse staff, the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on an outcome they had no power to influence. In December 2020, JD Sports withdrew. The reasons given were the complexity of the lease obligations, the same long-term fixed-cost rental agreements that the private equity firms had left behind 17 years earlier. Any buyer would inherit not just the stores, but the rents. And the rents on stores that were no longer generating sufficient revenue to justify them made the acquisition economics unworkable. The thing that killed Debenhams in 2020 was, in this precise sense, the thing that had been placed inside it in 2003. The private equity transaction of that year had not merely weakened the business. It had, through the mechanism of the sale and leaseback, installed within the company a structural liability that would detonate on a timer the moment the external environment turned hostile enough. The external environment had turned hostile enough. On the 1st of December 2020, Debenhams filed for administration for the second time. This time, there was no pre-packed structure, no managed continuation, no plan for the business to trade its way through to the other side. This time, the administrators announced that they would wind down the company entirely. All remaining stores, 124 of them, would close. All remaining employees, approximately 12,000 people, would lose their jobs. 12,000 people, not a statistic. 12,000 individuals who had set an alarm the previous morning, made a packed lunch, driven or bussed, or walked to a job they expected to still have. 12,000 people who had in many cases spent years, in some cases decades, in those buildings, who knew the stock rooms, knew the regular customers by face if not by name, who had Christmas memories of their own involving those particular floors and those particular staircases, and that particular smell of a building they had come to think of, in some private way, as theirs. The administrators sent letters. In some cases, managers gathered their teams and told them face to face. In other cases, employees found out the way they had found out the first time, on their phones, reading a news alert, in a car park or on a bus. The stores did not close immediately. The wind-down process took several months, during which the remaining stock was sold, reduced, then reduced again, then reduced to almost nothing. Customers came to the closing sales in numbers that had not been seen for years. There is something in the British character that responds to an ending with a particular kind of attentiveness, a desire to be present, to bear witness, to take something away before it disappears entirely. They filled baskets with discounted homeware and half-price cosmetics and clothing reduced to figures that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. They queued, as they had always queued, because queuing is what British people do when something matters. And then they left, carrying their purchases past the signs that said closing down and everything must go, and went out into high streets that were about to have a very large empty building standing in the middle of them. The last Debenhams stores closed in May 2021. The final location to shut its doors was on Oxford Street, the same street a few hundred yards from the spot where William Clark had opened his drapery shop 243 years earlier. By the time the Oxford Street store closed, the area around it had already begun to change. The building itself would eventually be repurposed, its 5 floors divided and reallocated, its retail identity erased. But the last Debenhams store to trade, the very last one, the one that kept its doors open longest as the wind down proceeded, was in Sheffield. On the final day, a small number of customers came, not bargain hunters by that point. There was nothing left to buy. They came to take photographs. They stood in the empty beauty hall, where the counters had been stripped and the display cases removed, and they took photographs of the space where the Chanel counter had been. They stood on the escalators, the same escalators in a different city that children had ridden up and down on Saturday mornings 40 years earlier, and they took photographs of the empty floors above and below. One woman, interviewed outside the Sheffield store on its final day, was asked what she would remember. She said, "The smell, the particular smell of the store when you walked in." She could not describe it exactly, perfume and carpet and something warm underneath, but she said she would know it again instantly if she ever encountered it, anywhere, in any building, for the rest of her life. She said, "It smelled like Saturdays." What do we lose when the place that smelled like Saturdays is gone, and nothing that replaces it smells like anything at all? In January 2021, while the last Debenhams stores were still in the process of closing, a company called Boohoo Group purchased the Debenhams brand. The price was £55 million. For that sum, Boohoo acquired the name, the website, and the intellectual property. It acquired the brand recognition that 243 years of trading had built. The associations, the memories, the loyalty that millions of British people carried for a store they had visited their entire lives. It did not acquire a single shop. It did not take on a single member of staff. It did not assume responsibility for a single pension, a single lease, or a single outstanding obligation to the 12,000 people who had just lost their jobs. £55 million for the name. Nothing for the people. The Boohoo acquisition was, in commercial terms, entirely rational. The Debenhams name still carried considerable recognition among British consumers of a certain age. A website trading under that name, selling fashion and beauty products to a demographic that remembered the original stores with affection, had a reasonable prospect of generating revenue at very low cost. No stores to maintain, no staff to pay beyond a warehouse operation. No rent, no rates, no fitting rooms, no escalators, no restaurant on the 3rd floor. It was retail stripped of everything that made retail a human experience and reduced to its most efficient possible form. A URL, a warehouse, a delivery van. The Debenhams that appeared online after Boohoo's acquisition bore the name of the original but shared none of its character. The website sold fast fashion at competitive prices. It had no beauty counters. It had no waiting list service. It had no restaurant. It had no smell. It was, in the most literal sense, a ghost. The name of something that had once been real, attached to something that had never been anything but a transaction. The buildings were the most visible evidence of what had been lost. Across Britain, 124 large retail properties sat empty or in the process of being vacated in the first half of 2021. In most cases, these were not ordinary shop units. They were anchor stores, the largest buildings on their high streets or in their shopping centers, the ones around which everything else had been arranged. A Debenhams departure did not leave a gap in a row of shops. It left a wound in the center of a town. In some locations, The buildings found new uses relatively quickly. Councils and developers, alert to the opportunity presented by large, central vacant properties, moved to repurpose them. Some became mixed-use developments, flats above, shops and restaurants below. Some became gyms or climbing centers or NHS vaccination hubs during the pandemic period. One former Debenhams in Wolverhampton was converted into a university campus facility. Another in Folkestone became an arts center. These were, in their own way, positive outcomes, evidence of communities adapting, of old spaces being given new purposes. But they were not department stores. They did not employ the same number of people. They did not serve the same function. They did not provide the same thing that Debenhams had provided: a single, accessible, central space where a family could meet most of its practical needs on a single Saturday morning, without a car, without a delivery address, without waiting 4 working days for something that needed to be tried on before it could be trusted. In smaller towns especially, the loss was not replaced. The building stood empty. The high street contracted around it. Other retailers, deprived of the foot traffic that the anchor store had generated, found their own trade diminishing. The shopping center model, already under severe pressure, accelerated its decline in the locations where Debenhams had been the primary draw. The social geography of dozens of British towns changed in 2021. Not dramatically, not overnight, but measurably in ways that the people who lived there felt before they could articulate. The 12,000 people who lost their jobs were not a homogeneous group. They ranged from Saturday staff in their first employment to floor managers in their 50s who had spent their entire working lives in the same building. Their circumstances varied enormously. Some found work quickly. Retail experience is transferable, and the skills developed on a Debenhams shop floor translated readily enough to other stores, other environments, other roles. Some retrained. Some retired earlier than they had planned, on terms less favorable than they had expected. But some, particularly those in their 40s and 50s, in towns where the retail sector had contracted sharply, in areas where alternative employment was limited, found the transition genuinely difficult. A woman who had spent 22 years as a department supervisor, who knew her store, her stock, and her regular customers with the intimacy that only long service produces, did not walk easily into an equivalent role elsewhere. The equivalent role, in many cases, no longer existed. The pension situation added a further dimension of injustice. The Debenhams defined benefit pension scheme had been underfunded for years, a consequence, in part, of the financial pressures that left insufficient resource for anything beyond the immediate cost obligations. When the company collapsed, the pension fund was transferred to the Pension Protection Fund, a government-backed lifeboat scheme that compensates members for a significant portion of what they are owed, but not all of it. Members who had planned their retirement on the basis of a full defined benefit pension received, in some cases, notably less than they had been promised. They had done everything correctly. They had worked for decades. They had paid in. And at the end, the number they received was smaller than the number they had been shown. The broader retail industry absorbed the lessons of Debenhams with the mixture of genuine reflection and convenient self-exculpation that industries typically bring to the failures of their own. The convenient narrative was that Debenhams was killed by the internet, by the irresistible rise of online retail, by Amazon, by ASOS, by a shift in consumer behavior that no traditional retailer could have withstood. This narrative had the advantage of being partially true and the disadvantage of being, in its complete form, false. The internet did not load $1.7 billion of debt onto Debenhams' balance sheet. The internet did not execute the sale and leaseback of the property portfolio. The internet did not extract returns for private equity investors while leaving the operating business stripped of the capital it needed to adapt. These were decisions made by identifiable people in identifiable rooms for identifiable reasons, with identifiable consequences. The internet accelerated a decline that was already underway. It did not cause the vulnerability that made the decline fatal. The more honest lesson, the one that the retail industry has been slower to internalize, is that the private equity model, applied to businesses with high fixed costs and long investment cycles, carries a structural risk that is not always visible at the point of acquisition. Debenhams was not the first retailer to be weakened by debt loading. BHS, which collapsed in 2016, followed a similar pattern. Woolworths, which closed in 2008, had its own version of the same story. In each case, the mechanism differed in its details while remaining consistent in its logic. Extract value from the business in the short term, transfer the long-term risk to the employees, the pension holders, and the communities that depended on the store. The people who made those decisions faced no legal consequences. They faced, in most cases, no reputational consequences of any lasting significance. They moved on to the next transaction. What do we do with the knowledge that a 243-year-old institution can be legally disassembled for profit, and that the people most harmed by that disassembly have no meaningful recourse? That question does not have a comfortable answer. But it is the question that the story of Debenhams leaves behind, sitting in the empty buildings on the high streets of towns across Britain, waiting for someone to take it seriously. Picture a Saturday morning in the autumn of 1974. The air outside is cold, the pavements wet from overnight rain, the sky the particular pale gray that Britain does better than anywhere else on earth. A woman walks along the high street with a child beside her, the child's hand in hers, both of them moving with purpose toward a set of glass doors that are already fogged with warmth from the inside. The doors open. And there it is. The smell arrives first. Always the smell, before anything else. A layered, complicated warmth that is part perfume and part wool and part the particular scent of a large, heated building that has been full of people since 9 o'clock. It is not a smell that can be manufactured or replicated. It belongs to this building and to every building like it, and to the particular era when buildings like this were the center of the world. The ground floor opens around them, glass counters lit from below, rows of lipstick, a woman in a black uniform who catches the child's eye and smiles without condescension, the way adults occasionally do when they understand that children are people too. The escalator ahead, wooden-edged, slow, slightly ceremonial in its movement, carries them upward to the floors above. On the third floor, the restaurant is already half full. The windows are steamed at the edges. A trolley moves between the tables carrying a large pot of tea. The menu is written on a small card in a plastic holder: chicken pie, poached salmon, today's soup, trifle. The child orders lemonade and is told yes. They sit down. Outside the window, the high street moves at Saturday pace. Unhurried, purposeful, ordinary. Inside, the cups and saucers make their particular sound. The room smells of pastry and tea and something that cannot be named but is immediately understood. It smells like being looked after. It smells like enough. Debenhams was never Britain's most glamorous store. It never tried to be. Its ambition was something quieter, and in the end, considerably more difficult to achieve: to be useful to ordinary people, in an ordinary way, for as long as possible. For the better part of a century, it succeeded. What it provided went beyond merchandise. It provided, in the most concrete possible terms, a space where the rituals of British life could be conducted with a measure of dignity. The wedding list that a young couple compiled on a Wednesday afternoon, walking the floors together with a clipboard, selecting the dinner service they would use for the rest of their lives, that was not a shopping trip. It was the beginning of something. The store that held those choices, that kept the list, that wrapped the gifts and handed them over on collection day, was a participant in the beginning of something. The school uniform bought in September, the Christmas decorations chosen in October, the birthday present selected from the home department on a Thursday lunchtime. None of these transactions were large in themselves, but accumulated across a lifetime, across a family, across generations of the same family returning to the same stores, in the same towns. They constituted a relationship, a long, quiet, unremarkable relationship of the kind that sustains daily life without ever announcing itself. Debenhams also did something that is easy to overlook now, when shopping has become so heavily stratified by price and aspiration. It held the middle. It was the store where a working-class family could buy something good without overpaying for it, where a woman on a modest income could stand at a beauty counter and try a perfume she could not afford, and not be made to feel unwelcome for doing so. Where children who had very little could look at the Christmas toy department and understand that abundance existed, that the things they wanted were real, were present, were in the same room as them, even if they went home without them. That particular generosity, the open door, the no obligation browsing, the sense that the store belonged to whoever was inside it, is not something that a website can replicate. A website knows what you searched for last time. It shows you what it thinks you want. It does not allow for the unhurried drift, the accidental discovery, the purchase that could not have been predicted, because the customer herself did not know she wanted it until she saw it on a rail on the fourth floor of a building she had entered, simply because it was warm and she had nowhere else to be. That kind of retail, patient, physical, generous with its space, required a building. It required people. It required the accumulated trust of years of transactions that went well, of complaints that were handled properly, of Saturday afternoons that ended with something in a bag, and the feeling that the trip had been worth making. All of that takes a very long time to build. It takes considerably less time to destroy. There is a worker in this story who deserves to be acknowledged, though she will not be named here because she stands for too many people to be reduced to a single name. She started on the shop floor as a Saturday girl at 16, sometime in the early 1970s. She stayed. She learned the stock. She learned the customers. She learned which regulars preferred to be left alone to browse and which ones wanted to be talked to. She was promoted eventually to a supervisory role that she held with the quiet pride of someone who had earned it over many years and understood precisely what it was worth. She watched the stores change. She watched the ranges thin and the carpets age and the lighting go unrepaired. She watched the queues on Boxing Day morning get shorter, year by year, until one year the queue was gone entirely. She watched the notices go up on the door in December 2020, and she read the letter that came, and she understood what it meant. She had given the better part of her working life to a building that no longer wanted her, not through any failing of her own, but because of decisions made in rooms she was never invited into, by people whose names she would not have recognized. She deserved better. So did the 11,999 people standing beside her. So did the woman who remembered the smell. So did every customer who ever stood at a counter and felt for a moment that the world was arranged in their favor. Somewhere in Britain tonight, someone is describing Debenhams to a person who never knew it, trying to explain what it was. The smell of the ground floor, the restaurant upstairs, the particular weight of a shopping bag with the right logo on the side, the way a Saturday felt when it had a destination at the center of it. The person listening will not fully understand. How could they? They were not there. But they will understand from the way it is described, from the specific, careful, loving way that people always describe the things they have lost, that something real was here, something warm and useful and ours, and it is gone.